So I'd like to give you a summary of Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur's experiment by discussing the worksheet that we went over. So I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it a little better. Okay, so spontaneous generation is the idea that living things come from non-living things. Before the 1600s, before Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur and others like him came along, this was the common thought process. Since that time and today's time, we believe in biogenesis, the idea that life comes from life. So what did Francesco Redi do? So Francesco Redi, if you remember the picture, he had 3 jars set up, and he put a piece of meat in each of the jars. The common thought was that flies came from rotting meat. So if you let the meat sit in the jars and rot, flies would spontaneously arise from that rotting meat. Well, Francesco Redi had a few different setups. One of the jars he left open, that was his control group, because he thought that this is what people think. The flies are just going to come from the rotting meat. And Francesco Redi knew that, or believed that the flies had to contact the meat, and the flies did something to meat to be able to make the meat produce new flies. And so the flies weren't actually coming from the meat, they were coming from other flies. And they didn't have microscopes then, so they couldn't see the eggs that the flies were laying. They didn't know these things, but nonetheless, Francesco Redi fully believed it wasn't coming from the meat. So to prove that, his manipulated variable was he stoppered one of the jars with cork, and so the flies couldn't get to the jar, to the meat, and also air couldn't get to the meat. And people would have said, well, wait a second, of course, it's not just the rotting meat, but it's the air that helps cause spontaneous generation. And so Francesco Redi had a third setup, a third manipulated variable, where he put gauze over the top of the jar. And so in that setup, the flies could not touch the meat, and the air could not touch, but the air could touch the meat. And so lo and behold, flies did arise on the jar that was open with the meat, at the control group, just like people thought, but nothing happened to the rotting meat corked up. And people said, aha, well, that's because there's no air. Well, in the third setup, not only did the flies not appear on the meat, but the flies actually laid eggs on the top of the gauze and actually produced new flies, maggots, and then flies from on top of that gauze. So it showed that the flies in turn produced new flies, that it didn't come from the rotting meat. So the controlled variables, besides different from the control group, were that there was the same jar in each of the setups. There was the same type of meat. There was the same amount of meat. The experiment was carried out for the same time for each of the jars in the same location, so they were subjected to the same conditions. And we already discussed how it disproves spontaneous generation, so I won't go over that question again. But I would like to talk about Louis Pasteur. So Louis Pasteur, he kind of built on Francesco Redi's experiment. He again helped to disprove spontaneous generation, but using nutrient broth. The thought at the time was that if you had nutrient broth, that it would spontaneously spoil if exposed to air. And Louis Pasteur said, I don't think it's just because of the air. I think that there's something in the air that's getting into the nutrient broth. Maybe some kind of living thing or something that we can't see. And so he set up these jars, this nutrient broth, in a specialized flask that had an S-shaped curve. And the interesting thing about the S-shaped curve was that if things fell into the curve from the air, it couldn't go up against gravity to get into the bowl of broth. So whatever would collect dust and dirt, whatever else was in the air, would just kind of sit in that bottom of that U shape in the S curve, the bottom of the S curve, so it couldn't get into the nutrient broth. So he first boiled the broth because he said, well, in the flask, he said, if there's anything alive in there, we don't want to spoil it, so we'll boil it first and then let it sit. And so lo and behold, over time, none of the nutrient broth spoiled. He then broke the S-shaped neck off the flask, and so allowed the flask to be open to things directly falling into it. And every time he did that, within a couple of days, the nutrient broth spoiled. So again, Louis Pasteur then showed us that living things come from other living things, not from inanimate objects or things that are not alive. So that's a summary for the Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur experiments.